We have arrived at question 17 of Prima Secunda of the Summa Theologia, and we are continuing on the treatise on human acts. And if you've noticed these last few days as we go through the dissection, as I call it, of human acts, that most of the parts of the human act have been associated with the will, okay, including intention and counsel and choice and consent. They all principally have to do with the will because the will commands all these different parts of the human person to their act. But now we are getting to a part of it that has to do with more of reason than the will. So it has to do with the intellect as opposed to the will. But as you'll see, the will and the intellect are very, very much tied together. This is question 17 of the acts commanded by the will. So you can see there is an association with the will. So it's very, very interesting. And I think it's important for us to understand and learn what is the relationship between the intellect and the will when it comes to human actions. All right, the first article, and there are 9 here in this question, says whether command is an act of the reason or of the will. This first paragraph is interesting because you're going to see how closely united the intellect and the will are. He says command is an act of the reason, presupposing, however, an act of the will. In proof of this, we must take note that since the acts of the reason and of the will can be brought to bear on one another, insofar as the reason reasons about willing and the will wills to reason. I mean, that says it all, how closely related they are. The result is that the act of the reason precedes the act of the will, and conversely. And since the power of the preceding act continues in the act that follows, it happens sometimes that there is an act of the will insofar as it retains in itself something of an act of the reason, as we have stated in reference to use and choice. All right, in both of those, there was a contribution of both reason and of will, and conversely, that there is an act of the reason insofar as it retains in itself something of an act of the will. Now, command is essentially indeed an act of the reason, for the commander orders the one commanded to do something by way of intimation or declaration, and to order thus by intimating or declaring is an act of the reason. Now, the reason can intimate or declare something in 2 ways. First, absolutely, and this intimation is expressed by a verb of the indicative mood, as when one person says to another, "This is what you should do." Sometimes, however, the reason intimates something to a man by moving him thereto, and this intimation is expressed by a verb of the imperative mood, as when it is said to someone, "Do this." Now, the first mover among the powers of the soul to the doing of an act is the will. Since, therefore, the second mover does not move, save in virtue of the first mover, it follows that the very fact that the reason moves by commanding is due to the power of the will. Isn't this interesting? Consequently, it follows that command is an act of the reason, presupposing an act of the will, in virtue of which the reason by its command moves the power to the execution of its act. All right, so again, very much connected. I love how he gets into language. English teachers would learn a lot from this. And as I mentioned before, psychology is influenced very greatly by St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, you might have imagined that he's going to ask this question because he's asked this almost every question in Article 2 about, okay, so humans do this. What about irrational animals? Do irrational animals command? And this is a very brief one. He says, to command is nothing else than to direct someone to do something by a certain motion of intimation. Now, to direct is a proper act of the reason, wherefore it's impossible that irrational animals should command in any way, since they are devoid of reason. All right, so that makes sense. We already said it's principally an act of the reason. Animals don't have reason, so they don't command. Whether use precedes command. Now, this is, again, Thomas's great sense of order, where he wants to know, okay, what's the ordering of all these things? Choice and use and command and consent. He says use is that which is directed to the end insofar as it is in the reason referring this to the end, and it precedes choice. Wherefore, still more does it precede command. Okay, because it's going to precede both of these. On the other hand, use of that which is directed to the end, insofar as it is subject to the executive power, follows command. because use in the user is united to the act of the thing used, for one does not use a stick before doing something with the stick. But command is not simultaneous with the act of the thing to which the command is given, for it naturally precedes its fulfillment, sometimes indeed by priority of time. Consequently, it is evident that command precedes use. All right, so that's kind of in the woods. It's kind of geeking out on some of this as far as the exact order of these things, but it's something that St. Thomas Aquinas is very much interested in. All right, number 4 says whether command and the commanded act are one act or distinct. Okay, so the act of commanding and the commanded act. And I'm just going to read this one brief paragraph here. He says, now just as in the genus of natural things, a whole is composed of matter and form. For example, man, who is one natural being, though he has many parts, is composed of soul and body. So in human acts, the act of a lower power is in the position of matter in regard to the act of a higher power. Isn't that interesting? Insofar as the lower power acts in virtue of the higher power moving it. For thus also the act of the first mover is in the form in regard to the act of its instrument. Hence it is evident that command and the commanded act are one human act, just as the whole is one, yet its parts are many. All right, so that's a good comparison there between the human person. We know that we have soul and body, but it's really just one. Okay, whether the act of the will is commanded, and this picture of this eye here is kind of interesting, isn't it? Is the act of the will commanded? Command is nothing else than the act of the reason directing with a certain motion, something to act. Now it's evident that the reason can direct the act of the will, for just as it can judge it to be good to will something, so it can direct by commanding man to will. From this, it is evident that an act of the will can be commanded. Okay, so the reason can command an act of the will. Number 6, whether the act of the reason is commanded. So now it's kind of like, is reason commanding reason? Okay, since the reason reacts on itself, just as it directs the act of other powers, so can it direct its own act. Consequently, its act can be commanded. But we must first take note that the act of the reason may be considered in 2 ways. Well, of course. First, as to the exercise of the act. And considered thus, the act of reason can always be commanded, as when one is told to be attentive and to use one's reason. Secondly, as to the object, in respect of which 2 acts of the reason have to be noticed. One is the act whereby it apprehends the truth about something. This act is not in our power because it happens in the virtue of a natural or supernatural light. So it almost appears to have some element here of infusion or supernatural light revealing supernatural truths to us. At least that's how I take that. Consequently, in this respect, the act of the reason is not in our power and cannot be commanded. The other act of the reason is that whereby it assents to what it apprehends. If, therefore, that which the reason apprehends is such that it naturally assents thereto, for example, first principles, it is not in our power to assent or dissent to the like. Assent follows naturally and consequently. Okay, so there are some first principles that the intellect naturally assents to, just like the will always is going to seek the good, always going to seek happiness. It doesn't have any choice with that, right? Okay, properly speaking, it is not subject to our command, but some things which are apprehended do not convince the intellect to such an extent as to not leave it free to assent or dissent. So there are contingencies, there are things whereby the intellect does have choices. All right, so this is number 7, whether the act of the sensitive appetite is commanded. And he says it must be observed that the sensitive appetite differs from the intellective appetite, which is called the will, in the first that the sensitive appetite is a power of a corporeal organ, whereas the will is not. Again, every act of a power that uses a corporeal organ depends not on a power of the soul, but also on the disposition of that corporeal organ. What he's going to get at here, I'll just kind of summarize, and we've learned this before, is that the rational soul has what's called a politic relationship with the appetites or the passions, irascible and concupiscible, where unlike the movements of the body, which we'll talk about in a second, they always obey, but the the appetites do not always obey. Okay, we do have concupiscence, we have free will, and so there's not always a relationship of obedience with those parts of us. All right, whether the act of the vegetative soul is commanded. And what Thomas is going to say here is that we don't command the aspects of the vegetative soul. That's like our circulatory system and our excretory system and digestive system. Those just happen. Okay, I can't stop that. I can't say, work faster. Those things just happen of necessity. And then the acts of the external members are commanded. He says the members of the body are organs of the soul's power. Consequently, according to as the powers of the soul stand in respect of obedience to reason, so do the members of the body stand in respect thereof. So if I say, lift your right hand, it lifts. Lift your left hand, it lifts. Close your eyes, open your eyes. The body is always going to obey, unlike the sensitive appetites and the passions of the soul. All right, thanks for hanging with me. And that was question number 17, 9 articles of the Treatise on Human Acts, Acts peculiar to man. God bless you. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us.